All right, good morning everyone, and welcome to the first educational webinar brought to you by WeatherWorks. My name is Nathan Wiles, lead meteorologist and assistant marketing director of the company. Today we will be discussing the topic of leveraging snowfall data following a lean winter. Not only will we recap the 2019-2020 winter season, we'll dive into snowfall statistics and break down some basic climatology and provide you with some important takeaways to guide you into the next winter season. In all, the webinar will take around 35 minutes of time and will be followed by a 10-minute question and answer session. Feel free to comment or ask anything in the question panel on the right side of your screen throughout the duration of the webinar, and we will review some of your questions at the end of this session. Today's presenters is none other than Frank Lombardo, President and CEO of WeatherWorks, and Robert Reel, Director of Meteorological Services. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Nate, and thanks a lot for joining us here today here at WeatherWorks for our first webinar. Hopefully there'll be a few more of these coming up during the next several months. I hope you find the information useful that we'll be presenting today. I hope you can incorporate some of it into your contracts and into your business models. And we really look forward to any feedback that you have for us since this is our first presentation, our first webinar. And also feel free to ask some questions. As Nate said, we'll try to get to those, as many of those as we can at the end of this presentation. Anyway, let's take a quick look at the outline here. We'll be discussing, first of all, we're going to take a look at the 2019 and 20 winter. We're going to review the winter because there's a big concern, especially for areas in the eastern part of the United States that had a very lean year. But that's not the case everywhere. And what we'll see is that parts of the West and Midwest actually did pretty good as far as snowfall is concerned. And some areas did really well in the upper plains and northern Rockies. The good news is that climatology suggests that there'll be a bounce back this year, and that bounce back hopefully will bring back some normal snowfalls to those areas that were exceptionally lean during the last winter season. It's ironic that we've got a very cold stretch of May weather coming up the next few days, and there'll actually be some areas in the Northeast that could see some snow and accumulating snow at that. So we'll learn how to utilize snowfall climatology. Our goal here is for you to incorporate some of that data to help retain clients and build contracts, respond to RFPs, and just utilize in your overall business model. And we'll take a look at the importance of accounting for mixed and unusual precipitation events. We'll end the presentation with a question and answer period, and Nate, our moderator, we'll take your questions. So let's take a look at the winter, 2019-20 winter. And you can see out west, especially in the Rockies from Denver up through Montana and Wyoming, snowfalls did pretty good this year. These are actually, as we'll see in the next slide, above normal in most cases, or near normal. Even the Midwest did pretty good with snowfall totals in the Milwaukee and Chicago area, Detroit doing pretty good. It's that area from Route 70 from St. Louis to Ohio where the amount started to shrink, and then south of that and toward the East Coast, most areas saw only about 10 to 30 or 35% of their normal snowfall. So let's take a look at our next slide. You can see the differences here in snowfall totals along the East Coast, along the Eastern Coast corridor. The amounts were, the departures were the greatest, 15 inches off in Columbus, 22 inches off of their 26 inches in Newark. I didn't even include Philadelphia because they barely got an inch of snow. They were about 90% off of their normal snowfall total. But this entire area saw below normal snowfall. But out in the northern plains, the Great Plains, Rapid City, 37 inches above normal. Chicago only missed their total at O'Hare by about 1.5 inches. So let's take a look at this a different way. And let's focus on the areas that did see either lean years or near to below normal. That included much of the Northeast and included parts of the Midwest, although the Midwest did fare a lot better than the Northeast. In the Northeast, areas like Syracuse, Erie, the snowbelt areas, the lake effect areas, did see a considerable amount of snow, but still fell about 30 to 40 inches below their normal. And a lot of that was because of a lack of lake effect snow. However, the major cities from Richmond to Boston all saw very large deficits. The exception, parts of northern Connecticut got a little closer to their normal. So if you look at this chart, the gray areas indicate the amount of snow that fell. The red areas indicate the deficit for the season or what the shortage was. And the blue areas, we don't see any in the Northeast, but we do see some in the Midwest. The blue areas are in excess or above what that normal 2019 through 2020 normal is. And you see the only places showing a slightly above normal were Madison and Detroit in the Midwest. But most areas did pretty good in the Midwest. The biggest shortage occurred in northeastern Ohio, from Columbus to Cleveland. Once again, the reason in Cleveland, no lake effect snows this year, or very little in the way of lake effect snows. And some of these areas, especially in the Northeast, saw their top 5 to 10 least snowy winters on record. The next section is going to be handled by Rob, and he'll talk to you about linear climatology. I'll be back a little later to talk about some mixed events and how to incorporate them into your contracts.
As Frank was saying, in particular, the Northeast and portions of the Midwest were the leanest this past year. So those are the areas that we're going to focus on right now. What we decided to do was create a linear climatology for some selected cities. So we looked at the past 50 years of data and we said, okay, what were the 10 leanest winters during the past 50 years? We averaged them together, and that's how we got that ugly red line next to each of those cities. So Albany's linear average is about 25 inches. Places like New York City, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Indianapolis, and St. Louis, all under 10 inches of snowfall on average during a lean year. Now we said, hey, it can't be that bad forever, right? Things have to get better. So what we did was we looked at the year following each of those lean years and averaged those 10 winters together. And that's where you get that nicer looking blue line that shoots up quite a bit. And lastly, we said, okay, that looks pretty good. How close is it to average, which is what the gray arrow is. And we see that it's pretty much right at, or in some instances, like in Baltimore and Boston, actually it exceeds average. So basically, looking at the averages of linear climatology, a bounce back of near to above normal snowfall is fairly likely the following season. At least it looks that way. However, as we'll discuss through this webinar, averages can be misleading. Out of that blue line that we saw that was back to normal, maybe 2 of those winters were really good and 8 of them were just subpar. That would average close to average, right? So in reality, we did a little more data crunching and we looked more in depth. Basically, the year following a lean winter is almost guaranteed to at least increase. It should at least get better. It's very likely to at least see 3/4 of average. So basically what that means is, let's say you average 40 inches of snow in a season, 3/4 of that would be 30 inches. So you're very likely to at least see 30 inches plus of snow in that example. As far as exceeding average, it's closer to a coin flip. And the raw data for those 10 selected cities from the previous slide all meshed together. There's a 93% chance that the next season will increase following a lean winter. 71% chance that you'll see that at least 3/4 of average, so kind of near to above normal snowfall. And to actually exceed average is a little bit less than a coin flip at 43%. Now, what I do want to point out about the average, you'd kind of assume, hey, 50% of the time it should be above average, 50% of the time it should be below average. That's what the median means. It is not what the average means. In reality, there's more below average winters than there are above average winters. It's not true everywhere, but it's true for the most part. Most places only see above average snowfall about 40 to 45% of the time, which means 55 to 60% of the time they're seeing below average snowfall. So over a 10-year period, you can probably expect that 6 of those 10 winters are going to be below average, 4 of the 10 are going to be above average. I won't get into why that is right now, but what it does demonstrate is that the 43% to exceed average of snowfall following a lean winter is kind of right on par. So obviously this was useful data, and obviously more of it would be great, right? So what we're going to do is talk a little about snowfall climatology and show some other ways to use this data. And in essence, snowfall climatology is historical data. It can be spanning years, decades, or even centuries. And with this, you can determine snowfall averages, extremes, variability, event magnitude breakdown, and much more. And this is all crucial data when you're determining contracts and writing up a business. It can be publicly available through NOAA. However, it's generally limited to reporting airports, which are fairly scarce and may or may not be quality controlled. So if you want higher resolution data, for instance, zip code specific with your client's property in mind, and more detailed information, you're probably going to need a private weather service. So how can we use some snowfall climatology? We'll start with a really basic example. Here is the 30 years worth of data for Boston, Massachusetts. And the first thing that stands out to me is, wow, up and down, up and down, up and down. It looks like your heart rate after a busy season, right? So how do we make sense of this seemingly unsensible volatility? Well, kind of the best first stab at it would be to look at averages. And what we have plotted here is a 3-year, 5-year, 10-year, 15, and 30-year average. Between these, they all range somewhere between 30 to 50 inches of snow. In general, the more data you have, the longer data set will normalize and smooth out the data and give you a truer representation of the real average. So that's why you see the 15 and the 30-year in Boston pretty close together, and both show that about the mid-40s is about average snowfall for Boston, Massachusetts. When you have less of a data set, it could be more heavily influenced by 1 or 2 anomalous winters. So that's why you see the 10-year shoot up to 50 inches, largely on the heels of the record-setting 2014-15 winter. And that's why you see the 3 and the 5 years down into the 30s inches of snow on average, largely on the heels of the last year or two of lean data. So a question that may pop in your head is, well, how do I choose the best year's worth of average to look at? Well, in general, again, the longer the data set, like a 15 or 30 year, will probably give you a truer representation. But the best for you might also depend on what you're trying to show with your client. And it might work better for you and or for them. Does a 10-year showing the higher snowfall make more sense to demonstrate? Or does a 3 or 5-year showing the lower snowfall make more sense to demonstrate? So the best can kind of be up to you. Now, the next question that might pop in your head is, okay, the averages are all over the place. How many winters in general see average snowfall? So what we did was we said, okay, for this example, 35 to 50 inches, somewhere between the 3 and the 10-year is kind of like a reasonable range for average snowfall for Boston. So we plotted that back on the right, and we see that 9 of the last 30 winters fell within that average range, less than a third of the winters. And this is true for most locations. Most of the time, only about a third to a fifth of the time does average snowfall fall in any given season. So the next question is, okay, is average even useful? The answer to that would be year to year, not maybe as much as you thought, but certainly over the long run, the averages definitely has some value for sure. But along the way, there's certainly going to be a lot of extremes, right? The average is made up of a whole bunch of different seasons, some high, some low, some in the middle, and you need to account for those maxes and mins. Within the last 30 years, heck, even the last 10 years, Boston is seen as much as 110 inches and as little as 10 inches. That's a 100-inch disparity over just a few seasons, where you could see 3 times your normal average and a third of it, all within even back-to-back winters, isn't unreasonable. So that begs the question, will you be covered for the next record-setting winter, whether the next lean one or the next extreme one? Were you okay this past winter? And it also begs the question, does your business model account for the average snowfall only occurring once every 3 to 5 years? Those questions are some that we'll pose and some that we'll aim to help with over the coming slides. And we'll start with a Snowtistics, which will dive a little bit more in depth. So this is one way to get a more location-specific data set. As opposed to Boston, you can get Beverly or Lawrence or Worcester, or as opposed to Chicago, you can get Waukegan or DuPage, as opposed to the typical airports reporting. Not only do you have that, but you have more data available. And this, I'll go through, I know there's a lot on this page, but we'll go through some of the data just to demonstrate how a Snowtistics can help you out. So again, this is a 10-year Snowtistics for Chicago, and we'll start looking on the left at the raw data, which is kind of ugly, but it's very useful. So on the top, we have snowfall by month and by season, along with some averages. And on the bottom there, we have the number of events by month and by season as well. Now, we talked about before how the average only happens sometimes, right? There's kind of more below average winters than there are above average winters. So average may not be the best way to determine the middle point. That's where the median comes a little bit more into play. The median is literally the midpoint of a data set. Let's say there's 10 or 15 data sets. It's going to literally pick the middle. It has nothing to do with the average. So generally, because there's more below average winters than above average winters, a lot of times the median ends up being a little bit lower than the average. It's sometimes a little better representation of the normal, but by no means is it perfect. In reality, the best way to probably go about figuring out what normal is or what average is isn't to look at a number, it's to look at a range. And one of the things that we provide in a Snowtistics report, as you see up on the top right over here, is the standard deviation of snowfall. One standard deviation will show approximately what happens 2/3 of the time. And that's what this gray area is representing, as opposed to the orange line representing the average. So clearly, it'd be easier to make a business plan and project things based on what happens 2/3 of the time, as opposed to what happens 1/5 of the time. So standard deviation can be very helpful. You don't have to necessarily use a standard deviation. You can make up your own range of what normal is. Just make sure you do that with some statistical data to back that up, like is provided in this report. Then the last thing that I'll show is event breakdown on the bottom, where we break down basically the salting versus the plowable versus the significant events, which can help budget for time and material. So a quick recap so far, and I will elaborate more on each of these bullet points, is most winters aren't average. So be careful building your business model around the norm. Average happens once every 3 to 5 years. Snowfall amounts can and do significantly vary season to season. Particularly be aware of those maxes and mins. Make sure you're covered for the next lean winter. Make sure you're covered for the next heavy winter. One way to do this is by balancing your contracts and overall portfolio. This can ensure more consistent profitability. I'm by no means an expert on snow and ice contracts, but I've talked to several experts in the industry, and most of them would suggest that balancing, for instance, both seasonal and per inch contracts would be a way to minimize risk. Additionally, volatility will decrease when reviewing a longer period of data. So the risk will further decrease if you do that, and stability will increase over the long run. And then lastly, zip code specific data as well as event magnitude breakdowns are critical for time and material budgeting. So to elaborate more on the first point, let's talk more about most winters aren't average. And because of that, when using basic seasonal or per inch contracts, they'll often be a winner or loser. This is something that Phil Sexton talks about, and he'll be talking about in an article that he's publishing in June. Everyone wants to be the winner. No one wants to be the loser. However, because normal snowfall only happens once every 3 to 5 years, most winters, there will be a winner and there will be a loser. Therefore, contracts will be viewed as unfair for one side, which will increase distrust while hurting relationships. And I can tell you right now that a lot of property managers who had seasonal contracts the last couple of years might be pushing their contractors towards a per inch one, right? The seasonal contracts, it was well below average the last couple of years. Meanwhile, the snow and ice contractors who've had per inch contracts the past few years might be pushing towards seasonal contracts. And again, all that's going to do is make predicting revenue and budgets nearly impossible, and it's going to further hurt the relationships. So what are some potential solutions? Well, on the contract side, creating fairer and more stable contracts for both sides is very beneficial. And as an overall portfolio, you can balance the risk by diversifying. So to elaborate more on snowfall amounts can and do significantly vary season to season, understanding snowfall climatology is a must do. You need quality data at your specific level, and you need to understand what that means. Once you've done that, coming armed with that data when educating your customer can be the finishing touch to creating a contract that incorporates the wide range of possibilities and what normal is. And it will help balance the winners and losers while minimizing risk. A basic example of doing this is adding caps and refunds in a seasonal contract. How do you determine what an appropriate cap or refund is? Well, a good start is understanding the average snowfall or the average range of snowfall in a given season. And just as, if not more importantly, understanding the maxes and the mins so you can understand your risk. As a property owner, are you going to be okay if we have a 3 times your normal budget? Will you be okay if that happens? And as a snow contractor, what happens if you have another lean season? Were you okay this past season? Were you covered? Did your contract cover you in such a way. And regardless of the snowfall amount, as a snow and ice business owner, you want to ensure you can achieve paying not only the fixed costs, shop, salary, equipment in a lean season, but also the variable costs, overtime, fuel, labor, particularly in a heavy season. Another thing that Phil Sexton talks about is demonstrating your value added, right? You want to make sure that you're covered in these years because you're not just working when it's snowing. There's preparation before, during, and after the season that all must be done. So make sure you're not only covered for the lean winter, but also the snowy ones and vice versa. The next point we'll go over is volatility will decrease when reviewing a longer period of data. So we'll start looking at the graph on the left, and this time we're looking at a 30-year snowfall for New York City. And the first thing I want to point out are the blue lines, which are one-year snowfalls. And as we saw in Boston, it's up and down and up and down and up and down. There's not much rhyme or reason. And in reality, for New York City over the last 30 years, any given season has fluctuated as much as 75 inches and as little as 5 inches. That's a 70-inch range that you may have to account for year to year. It's not very doable. So what you can do is you can start to look at a couple years of data, because data, as we've talked about, tends to smooth out and kind of meet at a midpoint the longer you view it. So what we have in the orange is a 3-year rolling average. We look at 3 years of data averaged together. The next year comes, we look at 3 years of data, and so on and so forth. And what we see is the range from the 3-year rolling average goes from approximately 45 inches to 10 inches. So right off the bat, just by making a 3-year average as opposed to a year by year, we've halved that. We went from a 70-inch range to a 35-inch range. And furthermore, if we were to look at 10 years, which is the gray line, which you can kind of see New York's actually been on a positive trend over the last 30 years, we see the range only fluctuates from about 20 inches to 40 inches. So the question is it easier to budget 70 inches, 35 inches, or 20 inches? Obviously, the lower the better. And while it's unlikely a customer will ever agree to a 10-year contract, settling for a 3-year contract can benefit both sides. And regardless of the length, even if it's only a year or two contract, and despite the year-to-year volatility, keeping a consistent contract type with the client will help maintain a balance. So all of this will increase confidence when budgeting and increase the chance for a longer lasting relationship. The last point I want to go over before I hand it back to Frank is event magnitude and zip code specific data is critical. So snowfall significantly varies from location to location. This is particularly true near large bodies of water or along terrain. So New York City, Boston, even Chicago area near the lake, all those areas will vary significantly. It's a little bit less in flat areas like Indianapolis or St. Louis, but there's still some variation. So what we'll look at is on the right, we'll look at the New York City area, and we're looking at 3-year rolling averages for 3 different locations, all within a 30-mile radius, well within most people's portfolio range, right? New York City is on the bottom in black. Caldwell, which is about halfway point between West Milford and New York City, tends to be fairly close to New York City, if not a little bit higher. By the time you get to West Milford, where you add some elevation about 30 miles away, they average 20 to 30 more inches of snowfall any given season than New York City does. Clearly, you can't have the same data set for New York City as you do in West Milford, and you probably shouldn't use the same data for Caldwell either. So you need zip code specific data, and you need a lot of that data. Not shown here, but furthermore, by factoring in event magnitude can also help budget time and material needed in a season. I'll hand it back to Frank. I think you got it working, Frank. Is that right? Can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We're good. Take it away.
Our next section, we'll be looking at mixed and unusual events and encouraging both contractors and property owners to utilize as much knowledge as they can gather on mixed and unusual events. We're going to make some suggestions on the importance of incorporating these into your business models and into some of your contracts, hopefully as well. So let's take a look at this slide first of all. This is a very elementary slide, and the reason I have it here is just to demonstrate that your client may not understand the difference between sleet and freezing rain. I think they know what rain is, and I think they know what snow is. But even snow plowing contractors will come to us sometimes and say, I had an inch of ice out there, and my contract says that I can switch the time and material for ice, but the property owner says, well, that wasn't ice, that was sleet. So identifying sleet and freezing rain, very important. Sleet basically falls as an ice cube from the sky. It bounces, it accumulates like snow, but because it's more dense, the accumulation is slower than snow. But when compared to snow, it's as much as 3 or 4 times heavier to plow or to push or to melt. Freezing rain comes down as liquid, hits a cold surface, and then freezes into a sheet of ice. And I would encourage you to take this slide and share it with some of your clients. So how do we account for mixed and unusual events? How can we accurately account for mixed precipitation, particularly sleet and freezing rain? These are the most troublesome, and these are the ones that keep popping up year after year. On average, you're going to have at least 3 significant events during the year that incorporate either additional work because of freezing rain or because of mixed precipitation that includes sleet as well. How do we identify an unusual or an extreme event? That's something that we'll look at in the next slide. We'll consider what the possibilities are. Some of you may think of an extreme event simply as a 24-hour event or as a blizzard, but there might be other ways to examine what an extreme event is. And this has been going on as long as I've been in the snow and ice industry. So as long as I've been talking to snowplowing contractors, every year this is a dilemma. It's a concern for property owners. It's a concern for snowplowing contractors. And I think the bottom line is, and Rob addressed this, it really comes down to education. Teach your property owners, educate your staff on what the differences are between sleet and snow, and begin accounting for them as one of the basic elements that you manage. CIMA did a poll last year for their June issue, I believe it was, of Snow Business Magazine, and they asked what metrics contractors actually keep track of to measure their operations. And most, of course, said snow plowing, the number of salting events, but very few, only 30% said that they actually keep track of the sleet and freezing rain events, or even try to differentiate between sleet and freezing rain. And we'll show you in the next slide how doing that can certainly help. Let's take a look at how snow and ice are measured, first of all. The standard methods for reporting frozen precipitation. Frozen precipitation is considered snow or sleet. So they're combined together and called snow. So your snow total or your snow sleet total is what you see on the WeatherWorks Certified Snowfall Total Report. Or if you pull a snow total offline from NOAA, what you see is how much snow and sleet fell combined. It's not separated for you. It's all considered one precipitation, frozen precipitation. However, when you plow snow and sleet, there's a significant difference. If there's 3 inches of snow and 1 inch of sleet, there's certainly a significant difference in the amount that you're pushing, the weight, the density that you're pushing. And it requires more resources. It might require more time on your part and more labor. It's different than a 4-inch snowstorm. Freezing rain, however, is clearly defined as ice and is synonymous to ice, and I'll repeat that several times in the next few slides. When ice is designated by the National Weather Service, it typically refers to freezing rain, rain that falls and creates an accumulation or an accretion of ice. So it's simple to differentiate from snow. There was a 1/4 inch of ice, and there was 2 inches of snow. And this certainly makes that part of it easier. What's challenging is when there's sleet mixed in, how do we account for the compaction factor? those 4-foot mounds of snow in your parking lot when there's only 1 inch of snow actually recorded, because there was a quarter inch of snow and 3/4 inch of sleet. So let me show you the next example. And as a general rule of thumb, you can approximate 1/10 of an inch of sleet equals approximately 1/3 or 3 to 4/10 inch of snow. 1/10 of an inch of ice, again, ice and freezing rain are synonymous. So 1/10 of an inch of liquid that freezes, it's about a 10-to-1 ratio. And you've heard this term a lot. It's about an inch of snow. A coating of ice, which means it's a very thin layer, but it covers all your parking lot, your walkways, is equivalent to about a 1/2 an inch of snow. And patchy ice, there's a spot that freezes on the colder surfaces, on some pavers, on some walkways, converts to about 1/10 of an inch of snow. Again, these are estimates based on science and the average amount of liquid water content or density that each of these precipitation types have. However, the actual work that you do in the field is often much more costly. And that's why keeping track of these events is crucial in how you estimate and budget for your snow and ice season. So let me give you an example of a snow equivalency report. And what this report does, it considers all aspects of the precipitation that's falling. Not only the snow, but the sleet and the freezing rain, and accumulates and looks at the water content of all of those types of precipitation, and then estimates how much that precipitation would have been if it was all snow. So for example, if your contract doesn't account for any mixed precipitation, if you don't have a T&M clause for ice or for freezing rain, or for when sleet mixes in, and you're just billing at the rate per increment, if there's a 3-inch snowstorm with 1 inch of sleet and 2/10 of an inch of ice, you'd be billing a 4-inch snowstorm. You wouldn't account for the ice. You would only account for the 4 inches. And where does that 4 inches comes from? It comes from 3 inches of snow plus 1 inch of sleet. If, on the other hand, you account for ice or the freezing rain portion, then you'd bill 4 inches for snow, which would be the combination of 3 inches for snow, 1 for sleet, and then the ice would convert to an additional 2 inches of snow. So 2/10 inch of freezing rain times 10 equals 2 inches of snow. And your total bill in this case would be 6 inches of snowfall. And finally, if you accounted for the sleet separated from the snow, sleet and ice and snow combined, you'd bill for 8 inches. 3 inches of snow, 1 inch of sleet times 3. Remember, the density factor is about 1/3 or 3 times. So 1 times 3 is an additional 3 inches. So the snow equivalency would be 6 inches for snow and sleet, 2 inches for freezing rain, and your total bill would be 8 inches. And for this reason, it's important to at least consider this in your budget planning. How many of these events do I have a year? And how will it impact my bottom line if I don't have a T&M clause? Other considerations are, if I do have a T&M clause, how does it affect any caps in this contract? Can I use those 4 extra inches for my cap, for instance? So a simple method available to account for these discrepancies is the snow equivalency that I just showed you. It's not perfect, but it certainly offers you and your client, the property owner, a better understanding of the amount of work that was done, and creates some equivalency to what would have been done if this was all snow. But there are other factors. It's much what I've found and what I've heard in the industry is that the equivalency comes close, but doesn't match the actual amount of work that needs to be done. So this is something you need to discuss with property owners, and contractors need to discuss this and come up with some equitable solution. My point is that it has to be included in every contract. You have to consider these mixed events because there seems to be more and more of these occurring year after year. Again, referring back to that survey that Simon did, about 40% of contractors indicated that they felt that there was an increase in the actual snow and sleet events, these mixed events. So keep track of how much the T&M mixed events actually cost you so you can make a comparison. If this was 4 inches of snow, I would have billed, but it was 2 inches of snow and 2 inches of sleet, and it cost me this much. I should have billed this much. And it will help you develop better ratios to incorporate into your contracts. And determine clearly how to identify and what qualifies for a mixed event. Is it freezing rain? Is it sleet? Is it a combination? Is it more than 3 hours of the event? All of these are very important because a lot of what I do is handle disputes, and the disputes come from the property owners who say, hey, the contract says ice, but there was no ice, or there was only a half hour of ice. So to avoid those disputes, to develop better relationships, identify these items now and before you sign these contracts. So accounting for unusual events becomes more challenging. First, we have to identify what these events are, but this is a gray area. And this is really where you need a sit down with your property owner and service provider. You know what events give you pain. That light, fluffy snow that occurs, and you blow away your backpacks, that doesn't give you that much pain. But when it's wet, when there's sleet and freezing rain included, that certainly does. So what might be considered some unusual events? A lot of you in your contracts indicate blizzard. Make sure you have a good definition for blizzard, and make sure you identify who has to determine that it's a blizzard. I've had situations where I've had calls from either property owners or contractors because the Weather Service called something a near blizzard. Not quite a blizzard, but a near blizzard. Conditions almost met blizzard conditions. So define what conditions you think blizzard conditions are. Don't just use the word in a generic fashion. Long duration events. Some contracts say, hey, if the event's more than 24 hours, we want to go to T&M. That's good, but maybe a 12-hour event of mixed sleet and freezing rain and snow should be considered as well, because those events might be causing you, might be tapping your resources much more than the long duration snow event. Exceeding accumulation thresholds. This is pretty common. More than 12 inches, I go to T&M. Mixed events, specifically dealing with sleet and freezing rain, how to include them in caps. I mentioned this earlier. Should the sleet come out separately? Should an equivalency be added? I worked with one property owner last year developing an RFP, and what we decided was that for any freezing rain event, regardless of whether it was scattered event, solid event, 2 inches of ice, they would add an additional ½ inch to the cap, so that you would get credit for a ½ an inch, even if you went out and salted for 20 minutes. And then extreme conditions. How does this affect your operation? If it's a 10 below zero snowstorm, does that make it more challenging for you than if it's at 25 degrees? If the winds are 70 miles an hour, does that become an extreme conditions? So we need to qualify what are unusual events. So let's start with the light blue square here, or circle, sorry. I learned that a long time ago. Location-specific climate data. That's where it starts. That's the most important thing here. Make sure your data is good. Talk to your partner, your client, or your service provider
if you're a property owner, and make sure that the data that you're both looking at is agreed upon and is based on good science. Then find the right metrics for what's going to kick in that T&M. And Rob talked a lot about this as well. From that, you can develop something equitable for billing for all parties. Again, you might be a winner one year, but in a winter like this, you won't be, excuse me, in a winter like this, where you feel that your client is a property owner, your property owner is a winner, you want to both be winners every year. So come to an equitable solution for all the parties. That'll develop a trusted partnership and also long-lasting relationships.
So I can
All
wrap
right,
things
so-
up, Frank.
Thank
So
you.
a couple key bullet points that we've taken away. So snowfall always has and will continue to vary season to season. And it's these extremes and these ranges that will make up an average. So it's critical that you know what these climate numbers are. And again, like we talked about before, don't necessarily just know the average number, understand what an average range is and make that work in your business model. Many of us experienced a down season this past winter. However, more snow will come, right? Those linear climatology that we put together suggests that. In some cases, this year was down as much as 90%. The question is, were you ready for this, and will you be ready for the next one? And on the other side of things, as a property owner, will you be ready when we bounce back and see a 100-inch winter or a record-setting winter? Make sure that no matter how much snow falls, you have yourself covered for the cost being ready to provide the level of service required by your contract. From a snowfall data standpoint, such as the Snowtistics that's shown here, and again, this kind of report we have available on a zip code specific level across the entire US, not just for major cities. But with this quality data, you can improve overall billing model and responses to RFPs. You can calculate more appropriate caps, floors, and refunds. You can identify snowfall trends in the near or long term, and you can determine a baseline or trigger for time and material needed with event breakdowns. So that'll wrap it up. I think Nate's going to bring us home, and then we'll have time for a few questions. Is that right, Nate?
Yes, sir. Thank you, gentlemen. You guys did well. We will now take the next few moments to review a couple of your questions that we received throughout the webinar. Any sales or data-related questions that we are unable to answer at this time can be submitted to the appropriate emails on your screen, either sales@weatherworksinc.com or data@weatherworksinc.com. And as always, we're available around the clock through our company line at 908-850-8600. This first question, this I'll direct to Rob, comes from Jim, and he asks, how do you ensure the accuracy of your data?
Yeah, so we talked about the Snowtistics reports, which again is something that we provide zip code specific level pretty much across the entire US, as opposed to if you're going to go to NOAA, you'd just be getting the reporting airports for the most part. So essentially, our Snowtistics data is comprised of our certified snowfall totals data, which most of you are probably familiar with. The process of creating a certified snowfall total, we go through all the amount of data that you could ever think of following a winter storm. And those snowfall totals come out usually 24 to 48 hours after a winter event. How we create those is first we look at radar, we look at airport reporting stations, we look at lots of different ground truths, such as webcams, satellites, and then we have all these different observers, both from the public and our own private sector, that give us these snowfall totals. We then have a meteorologist that quality controls all of that data. We take into account for any compacting or melting that might have happened, and then we issue a certified snowfall total. And essentially how these Snowtistics come about is they're comprised of 5, 10, 15 years worth of this certified snowfall totals data. And if we don't have the data that goes back that far, we reconstruct it after the fact to be able to give you a 10 or 15 year Snowtistics report. So it is quality controlled, and it is all done by a meteorologist.
Very good. Our next question comes in from Tim, and he asks, what is median snowfall? Would you say this is a better measurement of snowfall on a seasonal look versus the mean or average? Frank, would you be able to respond to this?
Sure. I mean, the median snowfall is actually the number that occurs most often. So it's typically a better measure of the average. I would prefer using the median to the average, especially if you're trying to represent either in a budget, um, what's most likely to occur? Okay? What's most likely to occur is the median or something near a range. I prefer a range though. I want to discourage you from, and Rob brought this up earlier, don't just use a number, don't just rely on the average, but rely on a range. The range of 40 to 60 inches, even though it's a 20-inch range, what will happen in that range? How many resources do I need in that range? This is my high end, this is my low end. What's important is that you need to know what the extremes are. You need to be prepared for that low year if you're a snowplowing contractor. You need to be prepared for that 120-inch snowstorm, a snow year, if you're a property owner in Boston. It has happened. It can happen. So those extremes are limits. If you want to use one number, I would prefer the median over the average. The median is typically lower than the average. Okay, and what we've seen is that there are more lower numbers than average than higher numbers than average. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah. And Nate, I don't know what your next question was, but one just came in from David, which was a great question. So he mentioned how we broke out the sleet conversions before and asked, is that something that we can do in the future since snow and sleet's reported together, or were we just doing that for the sake of discussion? I don't know if it's something that we'll be able to do in the future. So essentially, the Weather Service standardizes how they come up with snowfall, and snowfall is anything that's essentially frozen falling out of the sky. So snowfall includes sleet and snow. They're both frozen, they're just in different forms. So because of that, the majority of the snowfall reporters are going to measure that way. That's how the Weather Service standardizes it. So it's not standard practice to separate that out. However, one thing that we can do, and this is something that you can do, Frank kind of talked about the snow to liquid equivalencies. We do special reports. If you want to request that, we can go back. It'll take some more time. We'll have to go through some more data, but we can come up with equivalency reports to break out snow and sleet and freezing rain after the fact. You'd have to request that. It's probably not worth doing if it was just a coating or a tenth or two of sleet. But yeah, in those events that it was 4 inches, 3 of it was snow, 1 of it was sleet, that's pretty significant. That is something that you could request after the fact, and we can go back and reconstruct. But it's not something that, as of now, is all that doable kind of in like real time, just because that's not how snowfall standard practices are across the entire nation.
Right. I agree.
Awesome. Yeah, and one last question here we have come in from Carla, and she asks, do you have data specific just to sleet, ice, and freezing rain events? And this is kind of piggybacking off of your answer here. She uses a lot of de-icing products, as they may vary from de-icing versus anti-icing. This has a lot of effects on costs and the decisions of how much solid to use versus fluid product. So what would you recommend to her as far as our data specific in relation to sleet and ice, as far as like a Snowtistics product? Frank, would you be able to elaborate?
Well, again, depending on the geographic area, there may be an abundance of data available. She can certainly reach out to us directly, and we can explore that possibility. The amount of data that's available varies across the country and the location. We can come up with some generalities, certainly, and then we can create more specificity if needed in terms of how many ice storms, how many sleet storms, what the average number of sleet storms are. But I'd need to know a little bit more of the area. If it's a remote area where data is sparse, it might be more challenging, but it can certainly be done. I didn't understand the portion, Nate, regarding the different de-icers. Was the concern geared towards accumulations of ice, or?
Yeah, I think the question more or less was related to the data specific side. And as Frank mentioned, in regards to freezing rain, our Snowtistics product does offer a climatological look at freezing rain accumulations at your locations, site-specific and regional as well. So those requests can always be directed to our data team at data@weatherworksinc.com. If you do have any related questions as far as Snowtistics goes. And as well, our sales team is available to answer any of your sales related questions. But I believe that wraps up our session for today. It was definitely a pleasure having you, Rob and Frank, for joining us, and thank you for taking your time. And we wish everybody, a safe time, through all the struggles we've been dealing with, and we hope everybody has a wonderful week and enjoy the weather. I know we do have some exciting weather here in the Northeast for those of you that are out this way. So certainly feel free to get in touch with us if you have any weather related questions. And we do hope to expand upon this webinar series down the road. So we hope to see you again one day soon. So thanks again, folks. Thanks, Rob and Frank. And you all have a wonderful afternoon.